You may have wondered why I look so peculiar on the television. And it's partly, I must confess to you, the fact that you see my nose as it is. In most of the films that I appear in, I put on a false nose, usually as large as I can find. And one night in Dublin, right at the start of my career as an actor, I was playing in a play called Magoo of the Desert, which was in blank verse. I was playing the role of Khosroes, king of the Persians. And he had an enormous nose, like one of those Persian miniatures that you see. I put it on, began here and ended there, beard and so on. That's the way it looked. And in the second act, I had to come out with a young lady, a very pretty young lady, and a gentleman had to attempt to assassinate me. Another gentleman, Magoo, the title role, whipped the dagger out of the would-be assassin's hand. And on the opening night, the first night of this play, instead of whipping the dagger out of the assassin's hand, he whipped the nose off my face. And I was revealed as you see me now. And of course I was very embarrassed, didn't look very Persian, so I put my hand in front of my face. I had a long love scene to play with the young lady in blank verse. You can imagine how well that went down on the first night in Dublin. You were as beautiful as the desert, I don't know what all. Finally, I had to say a line at the end of the scene, at climactic point. I had to say to Magoo, had you not brought me into the temple at the time you did, Lord Magoo, I might have lost my throne. And instead of which I said, had you not brought me into the temple at the time you did, Lord Magoo, I might have lost my nose. At which point everybody burst into derisive laughter and the curtain slowly fell. That, of course, is a first night that I'll never forget. Speaking of first nights, I suppose the worst thing about any first night, the critics. For us, a critic at a first night is rather like a fairy godmother at a christening. From our point of view, it'd be so much nicer if the critics would only come on last nights. Then they could exercise their undoubted flair for funeral orations. I remember one first night in Boston, it was, Henry V. We were doing the show on a revolving stage, that is a turntable, big circular stage that turns. And when it came the great moment of the charge, I see you stand like greyhounds at the slips and so on. I had devised a plan which involved real bows and real arrows. This was folly on my part, as it later turned out, but I had a large target made of cork just in the wings, and 40 of the English soldiery, played by Harvard men, students from the University of Harvard. This was in Boston. 40 of these stalwart fellows were to shoot their arrows into the wings, into the cork target. However, the revolving stage started to turn a little bit too soon. There I was saying, "Cry God for Harry, England, and St. George," and as I said it, the turntable slowly moved so that instead of looking off stage left, we were looking straight into the audience, and 40 bows and arrows were pointed right into the theater. And I thought to myself as I came to the tag, well, they're university fellows. They're not going to just shoot into the audience. And so with a certain amount of confidence, I launched into the great line, "Cry God for Harry, England, and St. George." There was a tremendous roar, and I noticed with horror that the roar was from the audience because indeed they had shot the arrows into the audience. 40 of them. We even scored a direct hit on the Dean of Critics. I thought of the story because of what sometimes can happen to a critic on a first night. Critics really ought to be more careful. Now I hear that they're television critics. I'd like to dedicate a little story about a critic and a show of ours to this new profession. It's a murder story. It's about a critic who didn't like our shows. His name was Percy Hammond. Poor fellow, dead now. So I told you it's a murder story. The play was Macbeth, not the motion picture of Macbeth, which nobody seemed to like, but the Negro Macbeth. In case you think this is a little too crazy to be believed, let me assure you that there was a Negro Macbeth, that is a production with Negroes of Macbeth, that we did in Harlem some years ago in a government-sponsored theater, a Negro theater. And our purpose was not as capricious and foolish as it may sound, because we were anxious to give to Negro artists, who are so very talented, an opportunity to play in the sort of thing that's usually denied them. As you know, the parts that fall to Negroes are too often old mammies with bandanas and watermelon eating pickaninnies and Uncle Rastuses and so on. So we did quite a number of shows from classic repertory. We began with a Gilbert and Sullivan Hot Mikado, we called it. And encouraged by that success, we went on to Shaw and then backwards into literature, and finally dared a production of Macbeth, which was laid in a West Indian island suggestive of Haiti at the time of the Black Emperor, Jean-Christophe. And it worked surprisingly well, because the actors were very good, and changing the blasted heath to the fetid jungle wasn't as ridiculous as you might think, because there was all that vitality on the stage, and the actors were so good, and of course, above all, the witches translated terribly well into witch doctors, voodoo witch doctors. And these witch doctors were specially imported from Africa, because the governments in the West Indies took the view that there was no such thing as voodoo. So we had to go all the way to the Gold Coast and import a troupe, and they were quite a troupe, headed by a fellow whose name was Asadata Daforo. The only other member of the coven who had any English was a dwarf with gold teeth by the name of Jasbo. At least we called him Jasbo up in Harlem. I don't know what his African name was. He had a diamond in each one of those gold teeth. He was quite a character, fairly terrifying. The other members of the troupe not only spoke no English, but didn't seem to want to speak at all. They confined their communications to drumming. I suppose that the entire history of Shakespeare in the theater has never been a request on the first day of rehearsal for 12 live goats. Part of the cast. We said, what? And Asadata said, goats, black goats, for make devil drums. Well, we couldn't just go out and look for 12 live goats. We had to requisition them. This being a government project, we had to file the requisitions in triplicate. You can imagine what went on in Washington. I heard about that. But the goats were finally provided. The sacrificial knives were sharpened, and to the accompaniment of wild shrieks from the voodoo priests, the poor beasts were sacrificed. You can imagine the effect it had in the community of Harlem, when the whole Lafayette Theater was reeking suggestively with the odor of blood. Finally, the drums were ready, and the drumming began. The legend grew backstage, and indeed all over the community of Harlem, that to touch the drums was to die. And indeed, one poor stagehand did touch a drum and did fall from a high place and break his neck, and after that, Asadata and his rhythm boys were treated with a good deal of respect. And then we opened with Macbeth, and the drummers were fine, and the voodoo sequences, that is, the witch scenes, went very well indeed, and everybody seemed to like the show. The critics were very kind to us, except for Mr. Percy Hammond, who was a very good critic, and I don't want to speak disrespectfully of the dead, but he did write a notice in which he said that Negroes should never be allowed to play anything except Negro subjects, which went down, of course, very badly up in Harlem, and was taken to be an unfair attack on the Negro race. And at the height of discussion on this subject, I was approached by Jasbo, who said to me, "This critic bad man." And I said, "Yes, he's a bad man." "You want we make berry on this bad man?" So all this dialogue is very much like the native bearers in Tarzan and so on. I apologize for it, but it's really what went on. I said, just go right ahead and make all the berry you want to. They said, we start drums now. I said, you go ahead and start the drums, just be ready for the show tonight. They said, drums begin now. He die 23 hours from now. Drumming began. Fine. Show went on. I went home, woke up next morning, proceeded along ordinary course of work, and bought the afternoon paper to discover that Mr. Percy Hammond, for unknown causes, had dropped dead in his apartment. I know this story is a little hard to believe, but it is circumstantially true. And I thought it might be interesting for some of our critics to hear what can happen. Well, this is another voodoo witch doctor. I don't name, he's a Brazilian. I ran into him in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, a few years ago. I'll tell you the story. Before I do, I want to assure you that I don't advocate voodoo. I don't even believe in it. And that last story about the critic, well, he died. We all do die, and I'm sure that Percy Hammond, who had a wonderful sense of humor, would like to know that the story of his passing has been woven into a Broadway legend. In the case of Brazil, we were down there making a documentary film, partly for the government, but mostly for a Hollywood studio. This was at the time of the good neighbor policy, and it was my task to make a large Technicolor documentary on the subject of the carnival. And so we took up the whole question of samba and the samba orchestra, and when I'd nearly finished the film, it occurred to me that the origins of samba lay in voodoo ceremonies, particularly in Xangu, which are practiced up in the favelas, those strange native settlements on the mountains, which are right in the midst of the city of Rio. And so I arranged with a good deal of difficulty to film a voodoo ceremony. And we had protracted conversations with the head of the group, this doctor whose sketch I've shown you. And an advance payment was arranged for. He came to my office in Rio to discuss it. And it was my unhappy lot to have to tell him that the filming was off because I had just received word from Hollywood that the president of the film studio had been removed. That sort of thing happens not only in South American governments, but also in film studios. Had been rather abruptly removed. A new president was in his place, and the entire project was off. There was no more money to spend on voodoo ceremonies. And the witch doctor assured me that this was deeply offensive, and that he and his group took it very badly. And I said I was most sorry about it myself, and I did want to finish the film, and I did hope he understood. Ah, but he said, we have spent money. We have bought entirely new costumes. And I said, well, I'm awfully sorry, but there just isn't any money from Hollywood to pay you. And I don't know how I can explain to this new administration that the voodoo ceremony must continue. Certainly not in the time already agreed on. And I was called away to the telephone again and left the doctor in my office. Had a long conversation on the phone, begging and pleading to be allowed to finish this picture, which we rather liked. The material was very interesting, and I thought it would be a good thing to finish, since so much effort had gone into it. And I was pleading my cause for some time, praying that we would be able to. And I came back to the office and found that the doctor had gone, having been told that the deal was completely off, and that on my desk, in a script of the film, was a long steel needle. It had been driven entirely through the script, and to the needle was attached a length of red wool. This was the mark of the voodoo. The end of that story is that it was the end of the film. We were never allowed to finish it. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamed of in our philosophy.